Dear President Rovinski, Mr. and Madam Presidents, dear friends and colleagues, dear guests, I have already had the honor to welcome all the academic leaders and fellow scientists in this room or in the room downstairs today, but I have not yet had a chance to greet the online participants of this workshop. Are there any online participants? No. Okay. Later. So let me now welcome you collectively on behalf of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, proudly hosting the upcoming discussions on the key challenges of principles of upholding integrity in science advice. In the first place, I would like to thank ALEA and President Rovinski himself for accepting our invitation and choosing Budapest and our Academy's 200th anniversary for this important workshop. It is a great pleasure to cooperate with you on any occasion, but it is especially so when it comes to the SAPEA project involving all major European organizations of science academies. For us leaders of national academies, the reports prepared by SAM and SAPEA have always served as a point of reference, not only in terms of the evidence they collect and present, but also with regard to the methodology applied when they are produced. While we may have our own ways of delivering science advice adjusted to the national character of policy making, when it comes to defining general principles, we always look for the best practices represented by the member organizations of SAPEA and the European Science Advice Mechanism. Similarly, we have a high regard for the leading role of ALEA in producing and regularly updating the European Code of Conduct for Research Integrity. The recommendations of its first edition in 2009 served as a driving force for us in Hungary as we delivered our own Code of Conduct, which actually came out among the first in Europe in 2010. More recently, in 2023, when the latest revision of the European Code was approved, it was immediately translated into Hungarian, published on our website, and used once again as a set of guidelines when conducting a major revision of our own Code of Conduct. The theme of this workshop connects these two equally important areas, science advice and integrity in science. Their connection is not arbitrary or optional. Without integrity, science advice simply cannot fulfill its original purpose. It cannot produce independent, unbiased information. The importance of upholding integrity, therefore, should be the #1 priority of all those who seek to provide science advice. Let me quote one recommendation from the closing declaration of the World Science Forum hosted by the Hungarian Academy here in Budapest last November, confirming the global consensus behind the same principle. I quote, "We, the participants of WSF 2024, call on the scientific community to redouble efforts to ensure the production of trusted knowledge and pragmatic solutions and to eliminate harmful scientific practices in both the production and reporting of knowledge." End of quote. Easier said than done, but I am sure that at the end of this workshop, those of you here today will not only depart with a deeper understanding of the challenges, but will also learn about the principles enabling us to overcome them. And maybe when the time comes for the next revision of the European Code of Conduct for Research Integrity, among the many aspects of science integrity, we will also find some specific provisions pertaining directly to the ethical standards of science advice. I wish you good luck with this important work, and I hope to see you again in a couple of hours downstairs in the Academic Club, where a well-deserved dinner is going to be waiting for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Freund, for your kind words and for welcoming us so warmly at the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. I cannot resist just to say that it's not just words. We just received a medal as ALEA from the president of the Academy of Sciences, and I am really proud of it, and we will show it everywhere where we can. So thank you very much. And let me say that it's a great honor to be here in this remarkable institution, a place we already know, 200 years old, that represents the highest tradition of European scholarship and the enduring value of independent scientific inquiry. And on behalf of ALEA, the European, this is just for those of you who don't know all those acronyms, so it's the European Federation of Academies of Sciences and Humanities. I would like to express our sincere gratitude to the Hungarian Academy for hosting this important workshop and for its steadfast commitment to advancing scientific dialogue and cooperation across borders. Today's meeting is co-organized with SAPEA. And again, there's yet another acronym. You have those leaflets on your chairs. It is the Science Advice for Policy by European Academies. It is an important part of a science advice mechanism to European Commission, and it is also a special project financed by the European Commission. SAPEA brings together the academy networks of Europe, including ALEA, and I used to say that it's a network of networks, and it is to provide independent, evidence-based advice to the European Commission and policymakers across Europe. And SAPEA mobilizes the expertise of thousands of scientists. I am saying thousands because in principle we are more than 130 institutions in Europe. So we mobilize thousands of scientists, engineers and scholars from all disciplines, and that's very important. It's very interdisciplinary, ensuring that sound evidence informs better decision making at every level of governance. And this particular workshop is part of a series of joint events designed to strengthen interaction and exchange between academies on how we approach science advice, not only as a process of communication, but as a practice grounded in integrity, transparency, and trust. And by holding these conversations together across countries, disciplines, and institutional traditions, we help reinforce the shared values that underpin the European scientific community. And the focus of our discussion today, as you can see on the screen, is integrity in science advice, which is deeply connected to ALEA's long-standing work on research integrity, on academic freedom, and trust in expertise. I can say that these three elements form an inseparable triangle. I mean, integrity sustains trust, trust protects academic freedom, and freedom allows integrity to flourish. And a central reference for this work is the ALEA Code of Conduct for Research Integrity, already mentioned today, which has become a key European framework guiding responsible research across disciplines and countries. It defines the principles of reliability, honesty, respect, and accountability, principles that must also extend beyond the laboratory and on the field into the realm of science advice to policy. The question of integrity has become especially pressing in today's world. We are living through a period marked by profound geopolitical and societal challenges. Let's mention the ongoing Russian aggression against Ukraine, although it's almost finished, hopefully, devastating conflict in Gaza, and other crises that test our ability to uphold truth, humanity, and responsibility in the face of political pressure and human suffering. And in such times, science cannot be neutral about integrity. Scientific institutions, academies, and advisors have a moral responsibility to defend the principles that sustain free inquiry and evidence-based decision-making, even and perhaps especially when these principles are threatened. The way we as a community respond to disinformation, political manipulation, or the misuse of science will determine the level of public trust that we can maintain. This workshop offers a unique opportunity to explore how we can safeguard integrity in science advice, not only in the abstract, but in the complex realities where knowledge and policy intersect. We are privileged today to have here eminent experts, academy members, and practitioners who will help us unpack these issues, what integrity means in practice, where the boundaries of responsibility lie, and how institutions can protect and promote these values. Let me just conclude this introductory part with a crucial point. There is no integrity in science advice without academic freedom. The freedom of scientists to explore, to question, and to speak truth to power is not a luxury. It is the foundation of credibility and trust. Without this freedom, science advice risks becoming constrained, selective, or politicized, and society loses one of its most vital sources of independent judgment. By working together through ALEA, SAPEA, and our national academies, we can help ensure that integrity, trust, and freedom remain at the core of European science advice. And thank you again to our host, to President Freund, to SAPEA, and to all of you for joining this important conversation. I wish us all a stimulating and fruitful discussion. So these were just introductory words. And now let me return to our agenda. We have here an exciting program ahead of us, featuring an eminent keynote lecture, a panel discussion, and thematic breakouts. Let me, at this occasion, thank all the speakers and participants for contributing to such a promising and inspiring, I hope, event. And it is now my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Barbara Prańczak. Professor Prańczak is a distinguished scholar in the field of comparative policy and bioethics at the University of Vienna. She has served as an advisor to national and international policymaking bodies, including the Austrian National Bioethics Commission and the European Group on Ethics in Science and New Technologies. Importantly, Professor Prańczak has also been actively engaged in the ALEA's work, contributing her expertise to discussions on responsible research, open science, and the role of academic communities in shaping democratic and socially inclusive knowledge system. Her voice has been central in promoting a solidarity-based approach to science policy in Europe. Please join me in welcoming Professor Prańczak to the stage. Thank you.
Dear presidents, dear academy members, colleagues, guests, and also later on, as we learned, online participants, it's obviously a great honor and pleasure to be here and to open this workshop on integrity in scientific advice. I would like to thank Alea, Sapea, and I would also like to extend my congratulations and my thanks to our Hungarian hosts and congratulate them on their very important anniversary. It is an honor to be here. The topic of this gathering today, couldn't be more timely. Integrity is one of those words that everyone values, but it can mean different things in different contexts. For us today, the task is to clarify what integrity means in science advice for policy, why it matters, what we have learned in the past decade, and which challenges demand our attention right now. So, what do we mean by integrity? At its core, integrity means wholeness, consistency, trustworthiness. In science, integrity has long been linked, as you all know, to principles such as honesty, transparency, objectivity, and accountability. And this has been mentioned a couple of times, as is well known. Alea has played a crucial role in codifying and promoting these values through the European Code of Conduct for Research Integrity and many other activities. The code in particular has become a touchstone for good scientific practice in Europe and beyond. It has inspired a lot of institutional and other policies. So, when we bring these principles into the context of science advice for policy, then integrity means that the knowledge we provide to policymakers is transparent about uncertainties, about limitations and the assumptions on which scientific knowledge and advice rests. It's independent from vested interests, whether political, economic, or institutional. It's inclusive of different disciplines, perspectives, and stakeholders. That's an aspect that the fantastic Sapea document from 2019 also emphasizes on science advice in the context of uncertainty and complexity. It's evidence-based in the sense that it's rooted in the best available science, and also here I think that the definition that Sapea uses as evidence, as a knowledge claim backed up by science is a very good definition. But let me say a few more things on the requirement of science advice needing to be evidence-based or evidence-informed. It's really important, I think, that we don't understand this notion too narrowly. Most conflicts, well, maybe I should start by saying that it's very much acknowledged nowadays that values play a role in science. But my point here is about policies. Many policy conflicts, if not most, are conflicts not over facts, but disagreements on values. So I'm using a kind of not very partisan subject on purpose. Take speed limits on motorways. We can calculate how much lowering speed limits will cut emissions. That's what scientific evidence can help us with. But for those who are opposing speed limits, it's not about emissions. It's not primarily about reducing injuries. The speed limits for them are an infringement of freedom. It's a disagreement not over what facts are or what facts mean, but about the values that should be prioritized. Protecting the climate and reducing injuries, or expanding the freedom of drivers of fast cars. Whether we like it or not, this is the reality of policymaking, as many of you will know. The challenge for evidence-informed policymaking is often not, sometimes it is, but often it's not even a lack of evidence, but it's a disagreement on what the main goal of the policy should be. So, conflicts over values in turn require deliberation and not merely a recourse to facts as arbiters. They require that policymakers are open and transparent about the values that different policies support, rather than presenting policies as value neutral. So this is not something that scientists providing policy advice can do for policymakers, but we can support it. As the European Group on Ethics, which President Rowinsky kindly mentioned, which I have the privilege to chair, as our group noted in several of our opinions, making explicit the normative considerations and values that underpin policy choices is an important part of being transparent as a policymaker, but also as a policy advisor. So, in the European Union, science advice for policy has come a long way in the past decades, and decade in particular. The creation of the scientific advice mechanism, and also the work that our own group, the European Group on Ethics, does, and the consolidation of networks such as SAPEA have brought structure, transparency, and visibility to the way in which the European Commission and other institutions seek and use science advice. Yet we all sense that integrity in science is under pressure. President, you have mentioned a number of them already. I will highlight two challenges among the many that may come up later also in our discussions of the day. The first one is artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence, AI, is transforming the ways in which the lifeblood of research data are generated, analyzed, and communicated. And I think many of us, especially those of us who teach, will have seen how quickly things are changing at the moment. On the one hand, AI tools can enhance science by helping us to identify patterns across large data sets, simulate scenarios, and so on. At the same time, AI also raises questions of integrity, most importantly, who controls the algorithms, questions about equity and bias. So these challenges are, of course, widely discussed in academia, rightly so, and also in policymaking. But there's another issue that I think is flying below the radar of many policymakers and colleagues at the moment. The more policy and also science is relying on privately owned technologies, and by this I don't mean a small business, I mean large tech corporations, the more we are all giving up control. We are de-skilling ourselves. So de-skilling doesn't only happen at the level of individuals, it also happens at the level of institutions, and at some point also democracy as a whole. When core capabilities of evaluation, modeling, and interpretation are outsourced to machines, we lose the ability to interrogate underlying assumptions or to detect hidden biases and problems. We are then, if this happens, turned into consumers of technological outputs rather than critical mediators between evidence and policy. Integrity in such a context requires not only transparency and accountability of AI tools, but also deliberate efforts to sustain independent expertise, methodological pluralism, and human capacity for judgment. And all those things need to be learned, trained, and appreciated in the academy and beyond. And when we look at where a lot of the money goes at the moment, also at the European level, and where discussions focus, I think there is some need to emphasize those investments into human capacities as well. And then there's another challenge. Values such as transparency, equity, diversity, and the protection of human and civil rights and freedoms are widely recognized as essential not only for the integrity of science, but also for the quality of science. And the same, I argue, applies to science advice. Transparency in advisory processes depends on freedom of information and expression, which allow methods, evidence, and uncertainties to be openly shared and subjected to scrutiny. Equity reflects a commitment to equal treatment under the law and to the protection of minority rights, ensuring that advisory questions and solutions address the needs of all affected groups. So all affected interests is a core principle of democracies also, rather than reinforcing existing disparities. Diversity of expertise and experience helps prevent blind spots and strengthens the legitimacy of advice by incorporating different disciplinary, professional, and societal perspectives. And then the protection of human and civil rights and freedom provides the necessary space for advisors to act with independence, to voice dissent, and to resist capture by vested interests. And this is where democracy comes in. Being a democracy means more than running regular elections. Strong democracies enshrine deeper principles, checks and balances, independent courts, the rule of law, protection of individual rights, freedom of expression and association, and a vibrant public sphere. The protection of minority rights as well. Those actors who equate democracy with the will of the majority make a caricature out of democracy. All democratic theories define democracy as a rule of the people constrained by minority rights. So, assaults on liberal democracy, liberal not as a political program, but as in a democracy that goes deeper than merely running elections, rarely begins with a dramatic coup or with an outright rejection of democratic institutions. They typically start quietly, with the erosion of trust in the legitimacy of expertise, institutions, and pluralism. It happens through the use of majoritarian rhetoric, pressure on independent media, and the politicization of state institutions, meaning that public institutions, courts, police, civil service are gradually turned into instruments serving the ruling political interest instead of acting independently and impartially. And in the domain of science advice, this can take the form of political actors selectively discrediting or co-opting experts, framing scientific uncertainty as incompetence, or presenting alternative facts as equally, alternative facts with inverted commas, of course, as equally valid contributions to policy debate. Sometimes this is even done in the name of democracy, and I think when we look at what happens across the Atlantic and also in other places, we can all think of examples of this. But in an environment where facts are dismissed as opinions and expertise is portrayed as elitism, science advice cannot simply rely on speaking truth to power. Integrity here requires that we listen as much as we speak, that we explain reasonable uncertainty clearly, and that we engage with democratic institutions and citizens and not only with governments. Upholding integrity in such contexts means not retreating into technocracy, but making the process of giving advice more transparent as well and dialogical. I just mentioned listening as an element of integrity of science advice. This may sound trivial. Everyone says we need to listen more, right? But I don't think it is trivial. Listening is a democratic practice insofar as it expresses respect for others as members of a shared political community. In the context of science advice, genuine listening means engaging with the concerns, experiences, and values of those affected by a policy, not only with data or formal expertise. It acknowledges that people's knowledge of their own circumstances, their experiential knowledge, can reveal dimensions of a problem that technical analyses overlook. Yet, listening does not mean treating all claims as equally valid. A democracy must offer everyone a voice, but not every voice carries the same weight when it comes to questions of evidence, credibility, or moral reasoning. So here again, the Sabea notion of evidence as a knowledge claim that is backed by science is very important here. Scientific and ethical advisors must distinguish between hearing diverse perspectives on the one hand and condoning misinformation, prejudice, or vested interests on the other. So there's a line between those. The art of democratic listening lies in creating spaces where people feel heard. That's often a problem nowadays with trust in academic institutions and expertise, that people feel they are not heard, while maintaining shared standards of truth and justification. The balance between inclusion on the one hand and critical discernment on the other is what allows democracies to learn from citizens without abandoning the integrity of knowledge-based policymaking. Finally, at times where independent and free science is under threat in so many places in the world, those providing science advice also need to call out strategic ignorance when we see it. So strategic ignorance is a term from policy studies, and it doesn't mean that evidence is absent because it's hard to get. Strategic ignorance refers to situations where policymakers or politicians deliberately avoid gathering or evaluating evidence because that evidence might contradict their agendas. It happens when governments deliberately downplay or decline to commission studies on the projected costs of whatever it is, continued fossil fuel subsidies, for example. By avoiding to gather systematic evidence, they sidestep public debates about unintended consequences, in this case, stranded assets, lock-in effects, or the incompatibility of such subsidies with long-term climate targets. So to conclude, integrity in science is not an ornament, it's not a nice to have. Integrity in science advice isn't either. It's the condition of possibility for science advice to play a constructive role in our societies. In times of polarization, rapid technological change, and global crises, integrity is more fragile and more vital than ever. So today's workshop is a chance not only to reaffirm our commitment to integrity, but also sharpen our understanding of what it demands in practice. I look forward to our discussions and to working together to ensure that science advice in Europe remains worthy of the trust that is placed in it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Barbara, for this inspiring lecture. In a few words, you have explained what is our work about, so thank you indeed. And we are now switching to a panel discussion which will be on integrity in science advice, core principles and challenges. This panel discussion will be moderated by yet another friend of Alea, Professor Maura Heaney, Professor of Research Integrity at University College Dublin, elected member of the Royal Irish Academy, founding member of the Irish National Research Integrity Forum, and chair of the former Alea Permanent Working Group on Science and Ethics, but I can probably already announce that new group, a new council that is being established at Alea, which will work on same problems, will also be chaired by Maura, which I want to thank you very much. And please, if you can come to the stage and introduce our panelists. And I also would like to invite all the panelists to the stage at this moment. She will introduce you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll just give my pen. I'd really like to thank Alea, SAPEA, and the Hungarian academies for facilitating this workshop. It's very close to my heart, I must admit, because I'm very fond of policy, let's put it that way, and I'm particularly interested in policy as it interacts with research integrity and with science advice. So we have rounded up a really nice panel of experts for you today. Sorry, now there are a few changes, as you may see from the programme, but I think we've got a very nice balance of people sorry, I'm just trying to find. Yeah, okay. So I'll start with Anna, and please forgive my pronunciation. So Anna Marushik, very good, is Professor of Anatomy, and she's chair of the Department of Research Biomedicine at the Medical School of Split University in Croatia. She also heads the Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine. She's very much involved in the scientific publishing sphere. So she's the senior editor-in-chief of the ST Open, which is the overlay journal of the University of Split. She's editor emeritus of the Journal of Global Health and the Croatian Medical Journal. She was president of the European Association of Science Editors, the Council of Science Editors, the World Association. Were you ever at home, Anna? Is really what I want to know. And she also is on the very important Committee on Publication Ethics, which sort of guides journal editors, but also people who publish on issues around ethics in their publications. And she is one of the founders of Cochrane Croatia, which again is very much using evidence-based I suppose, health policy, etc. So thank you very much, Anna, for joining us today. It's a real pleasure to have you. Then next to Anna, we've got Professor Peter D. Lund. He is Professor of Advanced Energy Systems at Aalto University in Finland. He has also worked in the University of Helsinki, the London Business School. He's been deputy and head of department, director of the National Graduate School of Energy and Sciences, etc. So he's been an advisor to governments, and very importantly, he is vice president of the Finnish climate panel advising the government on climate change, and that's an ongoing position. So thank you so much for joining us, Peter. And next to Peter, we have a new addition to our panel. Oops, sorry. So Professor David Butz Pedersen, I hope I got that right, is Professor of Science Communication and Impact Studies at Aalborg University, and he's Director of the Frontier Centre for Advanced SSH. He focuses on management, communication, and evaluation of science and technology. He's a regular advisor to the European Commission, to the Danish Ministry for Higher Education and Science. He's a member of the Norwegian Research Council, and he's got a particular interest in open, responsible, and collaborative research focused on creating positive impacts for society. So thank you, David, for joining us. And last but absolutely not least, we have Dr. Marcus Pruchk. Yes. Okay, thank you. He's head of unit at the Policy Department for Transformation and Innovation and Health at the European Parliament, but he is also a researcher, and he's a member of the Global Youth Academy, and he's a fellow of the Heidelberg Academy of Sciences and Humanities, and he has led several international projects. But perhaps one of the ones you might be aware of would be Science, Numbers and Policies, which was a very well-regarded publication from one of his projects. And he has lectured at universities and conferences all over Europe, really, and the world. So Marcus, thank you very much for joining us. Okay, so I am going to move my carcass. Okay, so I think Barbara mentioned AI tools. They're certainly being employed increasingly in research, but they're also being employed increasingly across the public sector to provide a variety of services. So, analyse demographic data and other data on service usage, for example, which is very important, forecast behaviours, interact with the public. And the difficulty, I suppose, with a lot of these tools is that they are based on black boxes, that it's very hard to know exactly how the algorithms were structured and what kind of biases are introduced, let's say, through the use of these tools. So, Anna, if I can start with you, how can we ensure that the use of AI tools in the science for policy process does not undermine integrity or erode public trust?
Yeah. Thank you very much. It's a difficult question and would require maybe the whole afternoon to discuss that. I can speak from with my editorial hat on, because you all know that journal editors are not only gatekeepers, but they also are responsible for the integrity of the published record. They are faced nowadays with big challenges, with all the challenges that we had in the past, from authorship, plagiarism, all kinds of questionable research practices and outright misconduct. But now it has been, everything has been enhanced by AI. And I think that that's a big problem, and what we're talking about is about trust markers. Because integrity of the published record is important, and I'm talking about publications because for academic world, these are the best public evidence of someone's work when it gets published. Of course, it is better when you go into a laboratory or an office and look at the data. But what we see as a public is what we have to trust, and it has become a big problem, especially with the emergence of paper mills. Now in publishing we have a black market where you can buy authorship, you can buy papers, you can buy citations, you can buy reviewers. So we have reviewer mills, paper mills, authorship mills. So everything is for sale. So I do often feel like we have another black market in addition to arms black market, drug black market, and it's a lot of money that is going on there. And it's very difficult to see that, and we have just been developing tools to detect the use of AI. It started becoming, you had these tortured phrases in papers where you can see that it wasn't written by humans already in 21, maybe 22, but in 2023 you had in PubMed by January 18, you had 4 papers that had ChatGPT as an author. And it was very quickly corrected, and ChatGPT was removed as an author because they don't have legal entity to sign authorship statements, to transfer copyright, or to approve a publishing license. So that's now a common consensus in the publishing world and academia that generative AI cannot be an author. But then again, we will see what the future will bring, because, for example, we still name people, our colleagues that are deceased, we put them on the byline of authors, although they can also not sign things. So, one has to be very wary of the future, what comes in the future. And because of the paper mills, you all know that, for example, in 2023, Wiley had to retract 8,000 papers from Hindawi publishers. You have now journals, Cureus, the journal, just 2 days ago, it was announced that it was removed from the Web of Science because of the suspicion of paper mill activity. So it's really very difficult to know who a real author is, who a real reviewer is, and now the publishing community and all different stakeholders, including policymakers, are thinking about developing trust markers. This is a group united to act against paper mills that are first does research on what it means, what's the problem with paper mills and how they function. They have a whole kind of dictionary of the terms that are used to describe these activities. Then they have developed trust markers for authors. We have to know who the author is. Even ORCID is not a a way to really identify an author, because anybody can make an ORCID. Now what we are talking is about validated ORCIDs, where the institution validates the ORCIDs. But then again, you have, for example, group authorship, and how do you deal with that? Do you have to have ORCID for a group linked to individual members? It gets very complicated, and now we are developing tools to address this. You have to have also the trust in the product, the trust in the reviewers, the trust in the whistleblowers, and what we call the people who are sleuths, who are discovering problems with the published literature, how to deal with that. And I think there, for the journalists, it's very, very important that this process is transparent and that everybody who comes in knows what is expected, how the AI is dealt with. Unfortunately, the current... can I go on? Yeah. Because it's really important. The current standard, what the publisher or different stakeholders in publishing say, what authors can do, what reviewers and what editors and journals can do. So the current recommendation is if you use AI just for language beautification and just as a tool like Grammarly, you don't even have to declare that. But if you use it for anything else, that's analyzing data, text mining data, then it has to be clearly described and justified. And you have to show and prove that there is human oversight, that there is human in the loop when you're using AI tools. Then also, from the reviewer side, it's not acceptable that peer reviewers upload confidential documents into open AI tools, because that's infringement of confidentiality, of copyright and intellectual property. Then also, the publishers, they also use AI in their work, but the standard is that they cannot use open AI tools. They have to have in-house tools that they can develop and use, because that's the only way how you respect the confidentiality and intellectual property of the authors. And then also for the readers and third parties like, submission systems like editorial manager, reference managers, they also have to use in-house tools, and they cannot use open tools. So there are so many different things, and it's very difficult because research shows that when you're honest and say that you have used AI, people don't trust your research than when you don't declare the use of AI. So we are in a very kind of fluid state of the use of AI and how are we dealing with it. But I think transparency and integrity in checking, and what also was said, that first you have to do research by yourself, and then you can wisely use AI to make it better.
There we go. Peter.
Yeah, that was a very good opening. And let me just maybe, I'm an engineer or engineer physicist as my background. We use AI quite often already in research, but our research problems are very well framed. We have very good data. It may be a process, and we have a lot of data, and the AI works well. When we speak about science to policy advice, it's not about an engineering process, very seldom, hopefully. It's more about social processes, very complex societal questions where you have interdisciplinary issues. And I would there have problems with AI, as we heard here. But journals we don't have. I've also edited a few journals, and there's already guidelines how to use AI. But it's not there, the problem lies. I think if you use AI, you should be careful, because AI is, by definition, an automated decision-making system based on multiple algorithms. Would you trust that? This is the question. AI can lie. It can even murder, no question. It can do those things. At this stage, at least. So I would be very careful for giving that a power to make decisions. I think AI is more a tool. It assists, and you need human oversight. You need human judgment. What is human judgment? Basically, it is critical thinking. Would an algorithm be able to think critically, go beyond the state of the art, so to say? It would never go, at this stage at least. It has to be accountable. It has also to have ethical judgment, democratic values. We have heard today very much, and very good presentations this afternoon as well, about the core principles of science to policy advice, those ethical, moral questions which are very important. I don't trust AI at this stage about that. But the problem, as I said, is maybe not with the publications, but it is how the AI retrieves information. We don't have enough research about that. And you mentioned about that, about the bias of the algorithms, their transparency. We don't really know how they work. And that's where we would need much more research on that and on AI-assisted data retrieval, information retrieval. We don't have that information. We don't have this research. So I think we are, every new technology has its strengths and weaknesses, and with AI I think we are at the very beginning, and we are playing with the fire, so to say, in our fingers. We should be careful, in particular in science to policy advice, because, and that's important, if you have a system which can lie, what does it mean? It actually underestimates human freedom and human dignity. A lie is very bad because it takes the opportunities off from human beings. So if you would give a system opportunity to lie, it takes away your opportunities to do decisions which would be correct for you. You make decisions based on wrong information. And that's the worst I can think. That if Immanuel Kant writes a book about that, it's one of the fundamental principles of our ethics. So I think for engineering, okay, no problem, because it's so constrained, good data, machine learning, but for science to policy, which is very complex problems, where we, even as human beings, have problems to give a good advice and need a very elaborate process, I would be careful. And we need much more still research on, indeed, on the basics of AI.
Sure.
I mean, and I suppose I'm interested as well in, let's say, governmental use of AI tools. Because what you're talking about there quite often are civil servants who've got the shiny new tool, software tool, and they're terribly excited about it, but they don't have a fantastic understanding of the potential downsides. And I know that you've been thinking about that a little bit, David.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yes, so thank you for bringing me on the panel, and also thank you for that question, and to the co-panelists. I think this is already quite a rich discussion with a lot of detail. I would say overall to the question, how can we ensure that science for policy is upholding integrity in the face of use of AI? Basically, we cannot ensure that, as the co-panelist Peter just said. The moment you start introducing these technologies, you will start introducing a lot of uncertainty. So one value that we hold high in science, obviously, is reproducibility. Now we have been speaking about the reproducibility crisis for more than 10 years, and if there's one thing characterizing outputs from large language models is that you cannot reproduce them. You're simply not able to reproduce them. You won't get the same answer twice, and you will never be able, as a scientist or as a layperson or as a policymaker, to do any experiment or reproduce the answer. So you will basically get a new answer every time. So just for that reason alone, I would urge people to really keep a principle of precaution when using them. And then of course, what can be added more to that is there is a difference here between using artificial intelligence and using generative artificial intelligence. And there can be a lot of arguments made for using advanced statistical models and predictive models all over government in terms of energy consumption, smart grids, monitoring of medical devices in diagnostics, and that's all well and fine. We just had a Nobel Prize for AlphaFold last year, and there is a lot of good cases for using AI in science. But the moment you start using generative AI, in particular for policy advice, I would really warn to keep your guards up. We published a paper last year in Nature. It's actually called AI as Science Policy Advisors, that was later picked up by European Parliament and the European Commission and also the American Congress. So that was really impact on the ground after we published the paper. And one thing we saw there was that obviously a lot of institutions are experimenting. They want to use it. They're under tremendous time pressure. you know, the amount and the volume of output is just increasing. So there is that sort of need to do it. And the institutions we saw was engaging in it was people who were also formulating their own code of conduct. Like having actually, as the title of the afternoon session says, having actually ethical principles in place so that you know what you can do and what you cannot do. We know that a lot of policymakers are already using this from interviews. We also know that some mistakes are already popping up. There was a speech by a Danish parliamentarian in parliament that was filled with mistakes generated by artificial intelligence. I believe in the UK there has been 2 court rulings in which in the court ruling there was wrong quotations from artificial intelligence. So this is very damaging for trust and could potentially undermine some of our democratic values. So the way forward from here is to experiment, to build good ethical codes of conduct, and perhaps rather than just buying products from big fancy tech corporations, you have to build some of this yourself. You have to get your hands a little bit dirty and get yourself acquainted. So practical know-how is tremendously important.
Marcus, I'm coming from the Commission.
Or rather, European Parliament angles.
I beg your pardon.
I can certainly echo very much what my co-panelists just said. What I would dwell on is perhaps the most fundamental danger that I can see in terms of asking about the challenges artificial intelligence brings in this science policy interface. This is, in the end, really the question, do we still need science? And this might appear absurd from an informed scientific perspective of like academies of science here, but I think it's less obvious, you know, from a policymaker's perspective. We shouldn't underestimate the appeal of having the impression that you have the knowledge of the world at your fingertips in a private context where, you know, no one is checking upon you. You can formulate the questions in the way you want to formulate them, and you get the results immediately and quickly. So it's efficient, much more efficient than think about the science advice mechanism. You know, the process it takes until you get informed evidence, this impression of getting a result in seconds rather than months or years is very appealing. So I think still a lot of work needs to be invested in making clear that artificial intelligence can support, can potentially complement, but definitely cannot replace scientific evidence in the policy-making context. And I think this is really also where academies of science have a very, very important role to play. And I can see certain tendencies going in the other direction, because of course there are these considerations also of efficiency, even, you know, from administration sides or even within the European institutions, even for, of course we are still far away from it, but can we make savings by using more artificial intelligence? And of course, to a certain degree that's true and it should be used, but again, where do you stop? And at the end, do we really trust only ChatGPT, and on that basis we take a political decision? Hopefully not.
Okay. Wow. Okay, if it's all right with you, I'd like to move on to a second question that I had around policymakers as consumers of scientific evidence. And how can they make sure that they're actually applying integrity in that evidence for policy process, in particular where scientists have 2 hands, as was very nicely demonstrated this morning. So, you know, a lot of the evidence is tentative by nature, and also there is this kind of misalignment with timing. So the policymakers need the evidence now. The scientists will tell them come back in 3 years. You know, so there can be a little bit of a problem around trying to utilise the best evidence within the time frames, and how do we get around this kind of misalignment. So David, actually, I'll start with you this time if it's okay. What do you think the role of the policymakers as consumers of the evidence and possibly even commissioners of scientific evidence, what is their role in ensuring integrity in the application of that evidence then? Yeah, yes, definitely the role of the policymaker in ensuring integrity is extremely important. They are the lead users, the end users of the evidence we are providing.
And as we all know, in a room like this, we can be providing and supplying evidence from now on until the end of times. But what really counts is whether or not it's getting used. If there is an appetite, if there is what we call absorptive capacity. So do you have any mechanisms in place in which you can actually procure, commission, and organize your advisory processes? And those formats, when they are effective, often are not organized by academies or universities or funding agencies. They need to be at least co-hosted, or in my own understanding of these things, actually, driven and organized by governments or parliaments themselves. That's where you really have much better chance of getting research across. The problem, again, a little bit like with the AI, is that when we try to conduct qualitative studies on the use of evidence in policymaking, what we see is that, as Marcus just mentioned, that the policymakers are under tremendously pressure. The policy cycle has been so compromised. There is a lot of demand in getting decisions and legislation passed very quickly. And often that's what we see in some of the interviews we did in the Scandinavian countries. Actually, often science is seen as an obstacle to the legislative process rather than as a facilitator. And this has to do exactly with the two-handed sort of figure and all the footnotes that when we are invited to give a talk to government, we show up with 5 scientific papers and 60-slide PowerPoint presentation, and none of this is going to work with the policymakers, most of whom do not have a PhD degree. They left, universities more than 10 years ago. So we can help them on the supply side, but I also think that the policymakers need to be educated. So they should also orient themselves and inform themselves by principles like the ones Sapea and Alea have been formulating, like ensuring diversity, ensuring rigor, ensuring that there is accountability, ensuring that there is, at least to some extent, either scientific consensus, or if there is no consensus, be transparent and declare uncertainty. But I must also say, having worked very intimately with government, that this is very idealistic. Peter just mentioned Immanuel Kant a second ago, and it's almost as idealistic as Kant's picture of the Enlightenment, that when you look at the practical reality of how governments work, it is really difficult for them to uphold these principles. So dialogue, mutual learning, finding ways of engaging, and also for the academies and other institutions to help the governments actually organize these advisory processes are extremely important. But there is no silver bullet. I mean, we are just operating in an extremely complicated, complex environment. And even from a country like Denmark, we are often celebrated as sort of one of the leaders and champions of the democracy in the world. But even in a small community like ours, we are extremely challenged by political, ideological pressure also on scientific advice.
Thank you very much. Very, very good comments here. I would turn this question slightly more to the science to policy advice side and split the question to 2 parts. The first is the process to deliver the evidence-based knowledge and advice to the policymakers, the delivery, and then is the contents of that. And I think already the SAM mechanism mentioned this very quick delivery, that you have unprecedented evidence like the pandemic, where you quickly there's no evidence actually about that, and you need to quickly provide that. Or then we have very kind of slow processes. Maybe AI is one of those that we have more time. But I think in both cases, the process of the science to advise must be the same, because otherwise we actually kill the integrity of the whole process. So the process is, I think, with uncertainties that we have, etc., something that the science communities like Alea or others can administer. That's something that we can do. But the other question is the resource, which directly will affect the contents and also the quality of the advice. And here it is maybe a message also to policymakers is that this may be simplistic, but the more resources you have, the less you have uncertainties, and the quality of the evidence may be better. But the academic institutions, the academies of science and SAPEA, what their role here is very important, is to mobilize the know-how. And for that, they have the national academies of sciences, which are their agents, so to say, locally in different disciplines, and you can collect the information. But here again, it's important that, I mean, if you have one person to doing that coordination, or maybe a small unit doing that, it's definitely will affect the timeline that we speak about. The time-wise misalignment may be affected by that. So the resource is, I think, very, very important here again. And so the organization, I would just to summarize, would be basically the process. I'm not worried about that because that's what Alea and others are doing very well already. SAPEA, excellent. But the question is more the organization resource. Do we have that? And so if the policymakers want timely information, timely evidence-based advice, they should be also able to provide the resource to do that. I think the academies haven't that resource. I mean, there's something, but I mean, in that kind of extent that we're speaking about, I think it is very difficult to think about. But a small, maybe caveat still, is that our evidence is based on the state of the art. And again, if you have this unprecedented kind of phenomena, the integrity would actually require that we have time to collect the evidence. And as you know about the scientific process, you have a new information and the quite conservative existing information. You have to persuade your peers to accept the new information. That's part of integrity, and that takes time. So there's a conflict here, and that's I leave that as a question in a way that sometimes it happens that we don't have evidence, but our processes require to put 1-2 years, and we don't have the time. Question mark.
Yeah, thank you. So I would like to follow up on what Peter, but especially David, just said before, and following up also because on your question, and I listened carefully, because you asked about the role of the policymakers as consumers of scientific evidence, which includes for me already two presuppositions. Namely, first, there is actually something that is, available to be consumed. And secondly, there is at least a general willingness to consume what is available. And I think both are not so clear from the outset. I mean, even from a practitioner's perspective, I should say a lot of policymaking is so far still not informed by scientific evidence. It has to do with the speed of policymaking, but also, procedures, the inability also of getting the best evidence to the right people that are taking the decisions. And then secondly, in times of fake news, alternative truths, of course, even if there is evidence, no one tells you that there is a willingness to take note of it. And I mean, J.D. Vance claiming that the professors are the enemy, I mean, it's just not an ideological statement, but it shows, I think, also a state of mind in the sense of, no, the professors are not the ones to be trusted, quite the opposite. They are the ones, the real ideologists that try to bring us off the right track. Having said that, what I see is among those that, have something to be consumed and are willing to consume. We're fine. Yeah.
Too much for the system.
What I still see as maybe the most fundamental problem is, of course, something that is as such good, a somewhat naive belief that science provides ultimate truth. In the sense of, this is the way to go, and then, making clear that science offers just the best available knowledge at the given time rather than the ultimate is also a hard message to convey. Because it's a small path to, because if you give the impression, well, it's whateverism, then why should we use science? At the same time, if you give the impression it's ultimate truth, and then it turns out not to be true, this undermines the credibility. So I think also a lot of time needs to be invested in making clear. It's just we try to approach truth as scientists, At the same time, it doesn't mean that this is forever the ultimate state of scholarship. And again, this might sound naive from the perspective of science, but policymakers in these particular moments where you want to get input, you want to have a definitive answer in the sense of, should we take A, B, or C? And then getting the answer, well, you can take all three, but, this is, of course, not always so appealing and is often forgotten and leads to a certain degree also of frustration among policymakers. So I think this is also where we have to work and to make clear also for policymakers how they should treat scientific evidence in the same manner, namely not as ultimate knowledge, but, more as a guidance in a very complex to navigate environment.
Yeah, thanks. I would just like to illustrate this from the point of view of medicine, where we are very well aware of that science is not conclusive and it goes on. This is the reason why for us evidence is a continual process. We know that in medicine, the half-life of medical knowledge is about 5 years. Everything will be obsolete. Half of what we know now will be obsolete in 5 years. And that's why we tell our students, burn your books when you finish. And don't trust your professors, because, and this is the father of evidence-based medicine said, in a BMJ, and I'm quoting, your professors are full of bullshit as your parents. So learn your whole life and be critical. And I think this can be very important for the academia. So in medicine, for example, we have health technology assessment now at the EU level that is continuously going to look at the evidence and make decisions. At least, at the EU level and then at national levels. We also have horizon scanning, like for emerging technologies that are going to come, and we have to be ready for them. And this is here where academia, especially the institutions like academies, can be, the institutions that will do this horizon scanning and then engage with the policymakers to have a continual follow-up of evidence. This is what we do. For example, in Cochrane, it is expected that you will review and renew your systematic review on some intervention in 2 to 5 years, because new evidence is going to come. And I think we can even deal with the problems when you have unexpected situations like COVID. Then we learn how to do rapid systematic reviews so that we look at the evidence very quickly, not engage in a very long and tedious process of evidence assessment, but provide practical solutions now. And it will change maybe in a month, as it did change during the pandemic. So I think that the continual engagement of the academia, of researchers with the policymakers, and predicting future is very important here.
Briefly.
Yes, just briefly. I just wanted to make a brief reference to the work by the Joint Research Center on the social and behavioral psychology of evidence use, because it ties in very nicely to what Marcus just mentioned, and also Anna, namely the fact that there is never any bias-free evidence consumption. So all policymakers will come to evidence with some sort of value or interest or prerequisite for the use of it. And instead of thinking that all bias is equally bad, we just as scientific community need to understand what the bias looks like, what is the mindset, what is the prior knowledge, what are the interests, even what is the religious or ideological belief, and then we have to work in that dynamic process in delivering research rather than hoping for it to be completely bias-free, because policy is bias in a certain sense.
I
think you're okay.
There we go. Phew, getting the hang of this now. I think we'll kind of combine questions 3 and 4, if that's okay with you. In that, I suppose what both of them are talking about is the challenges to trustworthy policy. One of those challenges at the moment, well, 2 that are very kind of present, are challenges to academic freedom, for a start, but also challenges to the capacity. The veracity of evidence that has really suffered from misinformation, disinformation, social media influences, people wanting to promote a particular message and whatever. And I suppose, it can be very difficult for policymakers to compete in that situation and have their voices heard. But then I think it can also be very difficult for researchers to compete in that area, and especially if their academic freedom is also being challenged, and that they may be, both policymakers and academics, constrained in what they can say or how much they can push back against this sort of misinformation. So, Marcus, I'll kick off with you, maybe focusing more on the social media side, and then Peter talking about the academic freedom challenges, and if that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, this is, of course, also a huge topic, and one that goes to the very heart, of how science functions. And again, in the science policy interface, I mean, you have two ways to discredit, scholarly and scientific evidence. The one is indeed, you are flooding the floor, so to say, with other information, or you make it impossible that you even create already evidence, so to say, by, putting pressure on academic freedom. I would still dwell a little bit, if I may, on the academic freedom, because I think this is maybe the more fundamental issue, because we really see challenges to academic freedom around the globe, and we don't, the US is of course a case in point, but there are also other cases, and the problem is indeed, how to protect it. Especially even in societies where you thought, there are certain areas that, would not be challenged, who could have envisaged that, you see direct attacks, on maybe the most prestigious university of the country in the United States, in a country that at the same time claims, still to be the beacon of freedom and democracy. So I think in the end, there are no easy solutions to that, because especially in contexts where, the funding is not fully dependent on the state, well, there you can say, hopefully, the state functions sufficiently well. There are still checks and balances that ensure the funding of academia. But even in contexts like the United States, where this is not so much the case, you can see how much pressure you can still put on institutions by different means. Legal challenges, cutting funds, or simply not allowing students and scholars to come into the country. So I'm afraid here there are no easy solutions, but this is maybe the most fundamental threat, to science-informed policy making, because we are losing a little bit, the spirit of what science actually is.
Yeah. So if I may continue now with the freedom and autonomy. Yes, okay, sorry. So just highlighting the side of the importance of the freedom, academic freedom, and the independency of the institutions providing the academic advice and link that to trustworthiness is I think, I would look again more from the science policy advice point of view, and also look on ourselves, how we behave when it's about our freedom and autonomy. I would claim, and I like very much the session in the morning when MTA elaborates slightly on this process. But mostly we academicians and academic people are bystanders. Bystanders think about freedom of academic research and independency, which are the core values that we have. We don't protest. We just accommodate in many ways. And that's why I like very much the MTA kind of appeal on these two issues here. And the question is, have we enough stand behind these values and shown the people what these mean? Would a layman understand what academic freedom mean? What autonomy mean? Definitely not. So it is also to us to raise those questions, to educate the people, educate also the policymakers to understand what it means. The second question I would like to also address here is that our work as researchers, academic people, depend very much on funding. And I think in these very, let's say, rough waters where we are, I think it's a fallacy to think that the public funding will continue. And I think it is important in a way to prepare, as we saw already by the SEC academic science and the MTA, show how the financing could just immediately in a few years go down. We need to prepare for those times and to strengthen the independency of our academic organizations providing this science to policy advice. So stronger cooperation was mentioned this morning, very important, global cooperation. A cooperation with maybe your regional banks, non-profits, with companies, etc. So we need to find a new base, I think, also for independency. The states don't secure our independence necessarily in the future. Then there's a question also, but I've done very much work with the Commission and the science policy advice there too, is that the SAM mechanism that we have as SAPEA is a very important tool. It's a kind of core of evidence-based, one of the core of the evidence-based advice to the Commission and the European organizations. But what we see now is that there's a very much political stress and also initiatives to interfere research making and research governance. We definitely have evidence about what the Commission is doing, and my pledge is also to secure that SAPEA in these kind of very tough times would be kept independent, strengthen the independency, and also this evidence-based modus operandi, which is so important. These are not self-evident in the future. So that's the meaning of the freedom and autonomy, which we need to defend much more, as those are our values. So that's my point.
I just wanted to say that, I don't think that academic community should just blame everybody else but themselves. And I will again come from medicine to say that, for example, during COVID, we also let the politics enter the academic world, and many policies were made, suggestions from scientists, recommendations from scientists, but they're based on politics and not on evidence. Especially later on, maybe in the first 3 months we didn't know what was happening, but later on we had sufficient evidence, and this is the reason why you saw very different policies in the United States and in Sweden and Denmark, because evidence was politicized. And we have allowed that as scientists to make kind of political evidence instead of real evidence, and let the disagreements resolved academically and not politically. And that's also our fault. And we have to also have some introspection into why this is happening.
So that's self-reflection.
Self-reflection indeed, yeah.
Yes, obviously, the integrity, but also the independence of academic institutions is very important, and also an intrinsic part of what it means to have a democracy. So it needs to be defended at all means, because it is really a question, as Margaret said, about whether we have science or not. But when you look at it from an empirical point of view, studies both done in Canada and now we try to replicate that in Denmark shows that from the perspective of the policymaker, there is an inverted binary between independence and relevance. So the more independent you are as an advisor, the more irrelevant you're perceived as the policymaker. So policymakers are not always so curious about all your credentials and your doctoral degrees and your honorary professorships. What they are curious about is if you understand the policy cycle, if you understand their problem, if you have what the former Minister of Finance in Denmark, he called contextual competences. So those are the competences to actually contextualize your research into the policy-making process. So what that brings me to conclude is that that those statements should definitely not make us give up on independence, but perhaps we do need a multi-layered system in which some people need to be honest brokers, but some people need to be, if not, rather not dishonest brokers, but then let's say knowledge brokers in a system in which they have to provide evidence at the get-go to people who will use it for purposes that the entire scientific community will not accept. So the multi-layered approach, what the European Commission called the ecosystem of science for policy, is as important as the, sort of leading independent institutions.
Maybe a short comment also to the misinformation, disinformation question. I think there's 2 points here to make. Is first of all is the communication channel. If you think about information, you need a channel, which I call communication channel, and then you have the contents of the communication. I think for science to policy advice, it would be important to audit and certify your channel, that your processes are up to date. Because they also some of the science policy process parts may need updating once in a while. So audit, and show that you have been audited and you're a trustworthy source. Policymakers definitely, they at least in the past, they appreciated objective and non-vested interest type of advice, and that needs to be audited and certified, I think, properly. The second point is about just our role as scientists in communication, and it relates also to the question of misinformation. When that is spreading, it spreads like the fire. You need to quickly stop that. You need very quickly, because otherwise it's done. In the sense, it becomes the truth very often. And that's where the scientific communities could be more active. MTA mentioned the very good examples about the scientific communication. I think that need to be more stronger, maybe also implemented in the curriculum and your maybe scientific progress. Nowadays, if you think about scientists to give scientific advice, scientific communication, it's an extra burden, it's a workload. People don't like to do that. So incentivize in universities, academies that put that as part of your progress, so to say, on your career. Give a bonus about that, so that people in science becomes also science communicators, and also give education them how to communicate, and maybe have a course how to do that. That's what we could do. And think about how many scientists do we have within ALEA, ESAC, etc. There's thousands, I would say tens of thousands of scientists. And if those all would be science communicators, I think it is definitely a counterbalance to all the misinformation, disinformation that we have. And SAPEA, of course, and ALEA, ESAC play a very important role here too.
Yeah. Of course, scientists are notoriously bad communicators, so I don't know exactly how much education they're going to need. I would really like to throw this open to the floor now for people who may have questions for the panel. And actually, I'm just going to go over here so I can see who's... and Barbara, I think you were first off the blocks, followed by yourself. Just to say, try to use the microphone so that the recording will pick up your question.
So thank you to all panelists for a very, very rich discussion. David, although I agree with a lot of things you said, I think your last statement about the trade-off between independence and relevance, I think is a false dichotomy. It seems to me that there's a trade-off between being seen as partisan and independent, but I don't think, and it would be a very dramatic insight for our field if somebody who stands for independence and scholarly accomplishment would be seen as less relevant, which is also not my experience. I wonder what you and other colleagues think about that.
Yeah.
I must say, if I can answer before you, I understand it that you have to be an expert, but you also have to have the knowledge of the process and then the policy making, so that you understand not only the knowledge, but also what is needed and what is existing, so that you can then contribute. So that I don't think that then you are...
Well, I can just clarify briefly by saying that this is the results that's coming out in qualitative interviews with policymakers, that the longer you're perceived to be positioned away from the policy process, the less relevance you perceive to have. And what that means is that if you're just invited to come to Parliament for a hearing to offload your objective independent knowledge, most of the civil servants in the room will not take notes, they will not download your papers, and they will not go home and change their mind. What they are looking for when you ask them, I'm not saying this is an ideal or position, I'm not endorsing it personally, what they're looking for is people who know, as Anna just said, how to work with the policymaker, how to close the door, how to be able to do trade-offs. So in a situation in which you need to pass legislation, you need somebody who's accomplished in understanding the problem at hand rather than the independence.
That's distant, not independent.
Yeah, you can call that.
Yeah, no, I'm not quite surprised about the results in terms of kind of that just having, a certain degree, a certain competence, or qualifications that matter in the academic world are not necessarily translated one-to-one in the political world. And to a certain degree, I understand the policymaker, because when you are pressurized, confronted with so much input that you permanently get, a lot is lobbyism, but also evidence, because you get different kinds of reports and things and stuff. It's not automatically so that you have this element of trust. Just because now there is this famous professor, still there is the perception, is there a hidden political agenda? And why should I trust that person? And in the end, I think it's also a human element, this element of trust. And if someone at least knows already the process, this is maybe a first step of trust. Second level of trust is then, of course, if you have collaborated with that person and it turns out, well, that's really someone who has not a hidden political agenda. So I just wanted to say I'm not entirely surprised about the result, even though it might sound a bit harsh, in terms of when you present it in a way like what really matters is knowledge of the process and maybe the people, but I think that's how it works in the end. And what is often sometimes forgotten, this element of trust is not just trust in the quality of the scientific evidence. This is, of course, a precondition, but this element of personal trust. Yeah. And trust also that the person understands what David said, what do we need? Because you don't want to be told as policymaker, you're stupid, I have the solution, but in the elections it's you then, that has to stand up for what I suggested. If it works, fine. If not, well, it's you who, so I think sometimes to be blunt here, I think academia makes itself also a bit too easy in the sense of, passing it on, and thinking we know it, they should do it. But in the end, the responsibility for the decisions that you take are on the politician's side. So I think sometimes a little bit more understanding for the policymakers would also help.
Yes, I would definitely support this in the sense that if you give science to policy advice just ad hoc, you would not do much impact. And typically my experience is that you need to do a lot of background work actually with the policymakers. So you need a kind of a dialogue already on the background to really see what's on the agenda, what are the questions you need to address, and that in a way focuses your work on the relevance. So you need both excellence and relevance. Excellence alone doesn't help, but it's excellence and relevance that need to be there, and that also helps you to understand the affinities of the politicians. As you said, there's always a bias. I think the bias would not be that important in the sense that for the science to policy process, because it's not about decision making. Science to policy is an advice to policymakers, understanding that they have different affinities, different values, but importantly they would maybe use that information in their decision. But we don't make the decision for them, and that's important to keep in mind.
Yes, sorry, no.
Thank you very much. Samsa Holopainen from the Young Academy Finland. So my question is related to this topic of independence and something that Professor Lund mentioned, that you said that it's a fallacy to think that the public foundation, like public funding, will continue, if I understood correctly, and we should look for alternative sources for funding our research. And like, for example, in Finland, we have many independent foundations that fund, especially in the humanities, a lot of research. That my background is in linguistics, so a lot of research on humanities is done on not on public funding, but with funding from project funding from independent foundations. And in Finland, people don't really see this as a problem. But I have sometimes heard from colleagues elsewhere that if you have this situation that you have a lot of different private funders, you get this sort of, you can end up in a situation where the private funders, of course, can have their own interests. And so basically that's what I wanted to ask. So do you think that if we sort of don't get the funding, I mean, this relates to bigger problems of research, not only to integrity in scientific advice, but obviously this is also related. So if we don't get the public funding, but funding from private sources, does that sort of downplay the integrity of scientific advice? Do you see a danger in this? So would be interested in hearing about this. Thank you.
May I take that? So if I may slightly get around the question and just to stress that the importance of the academies of science, as they are very often independent and very often they have even a financial independency. So in this kind of time where we live, where the cuts in research may be very dramatic and quick, I think it stresses the role of the academies of science and these organizations that traditionally have had independency and which as today speak for the freedom and for autonomy, and they can afford that. But I would say these kind of alliances with NGOs or even with companies, I mean, as long as we keep up with our principles, I would say it may be okay. But that has to be open, that has to be transparent, and it has to serve the purpose that the science to policy advice have. And it could be even foundations. So those who have an interest, so to say, objectively support the science to policy advice and would not have a vested interest in that, I think would be fine. But I think we have a lot of signals from outside now that the public funding seems to be many corners of the world jeopardized. So you need to be careful not to lean too much to that. And that's why for the advice, which I think is so important, the evidence-based advice to prepare ourselves for the worst and hope the best.
Hello, my name is Jacques Verhaes. I work since 2015, I work for the Science Advice Mechanism in the European Commission, and also for the European Group in Ethics, the Science and New Technologies, and also for the Ethics and Research Integrity Unit in that context. And my question is, in relation to what Professor Lund said, would it help for our discussion, maybe make a distinction between the integrity of science advice and what is done afterwards with that science advice in the scientific decision making? So we can speak about integrity or whatever we want, maybe it's brilliant, but then what the politicians do with it, what is that? And when we speak about trustworthiness, is the trustworthiness lost at the level of the science advice or at the level where politicians take the science advice and do something black box with it? Politics is interest representation. Politics is the art of the possible. So the distance between the beautiful science advice and then the decision that comes out of it, is it not there that mishaps and distrust happens?
A good question, and again, I think on the whole process of science to policy advice is that we definitely target for impact, that it will be implemented in policies, etc. But now, in terms of the integrity, it is clear that we understand that policy processes have so many other elements that need to be respected. Advice is just one piece of that. My experience with the birth of the science to policy advice, even this case, where it may not have impact, is that there's twofold. First, there's not a vested interest. Well, there may be some small bias, as we heard about. And so this is trustworthy information. And the second point is that because of the science involved here, what do science work with? They work with the future. You can inform the policymakers about what's waiting behind the corner. And that is very valuable. And even though they would not implement that policy advice directly, that they have a signal about that there may be something that they need to keep track on. So the advice may lead to effects, but that's not the let's say, just motivation for that. But it is really to advise, and there's many side effects that we haven't actually, as I've mentioned here, that we haven't dealt with, which would be very, very helpful, which are helpful for the policymakers too, and may later on affect. So there may be not be an immediate impact, so to say, but it may come over time. And as said, we never know what happens with that. But my experience is that I've seen many instances where the effects come maybe after 3-4 years, and we can track that. By the way, it's based on this advice that we're given.
Yes, no, I think that's a very good distinction to be made between how you have a well-organized advisory process and then what happens afterwards. And I think in a conversation like this one, we need to keep that in mind, that those are two separate things, and we also have to respect that. I myself is also a professor of impact studies, so we are trying constantly to become better at mapping different types of impact, including policy impact. Which is per definition very hard to track, because the research and the evidence and the advice is translated, if not into a black box, then into a community and into a conversation that is very different than the scientific one, and in which there are also all sorts of co-constituencies. There might be, an opportunity, there might be a funding program, there might be a political opposing party that would like to join. Had they not wanted to join, you would have had zero impact. So in the end of the day, much of that impact can actually not be ascribed to the science only, but also to the political environment. And just finally, it reminds me of something that Peter Glückman always taught me when I was asking him how we could develop impact measures. He said, David, most of the time my own advice as a chief scientist to the government of New Zealand has actually not been to deliver any evidence or independent advice. It has been to avoid bad decisions. So because the Prime Minister had a phone call and he could ask me, we could have a personal conversation, and I could tell him what is doable and feasible and what do we know. And he said all those conversations, although bad decisions that would otherwise have been taken, are not to be tracked anywhere in any statistics.
Brilliant. Marcus, we've got 2 minutes.
Okay, yeah, just quickly, I just wanted also to follow up now on what Peter and David said. Namely, I think it depends very much on what your expectations into, scientific evidence in the policy-making process is. Indeed, if the expectations is direct and full impact, this is made for frustration, clearly. But because in the end, it's not just that, policymakers in the end, as Peter, I think, said, scientific evidence is maximum one piece, of, in a way, evidence, at least in their perception. They're exposed to other pressures. They might have to take into consideration, can they get re-elected? Now, of course, again, we don't want to enter the discussion between statesman and policy and politician, but in the end, if you can't implement your policies, there's not much of a point, to start something if you don't get re-elected. So I think what you said, art of the possible, is maybe also applicable for science advice, in the sense of we have to see what does it do in the long run, and even if it's just avoiding the worst, maybe it has an effect.
Yeah, I just want to say that maybe we can have an experiment that is ongoing in Europe with the regulation on HTA. We're going to have European joint clinical assessment at the level of Europe, and then the member states have to look at national, ethical, legal, social aspects and make a policy decision for themselves. So that's the difference between evidence and then policy making.
Very quick.
Very quick. So, again, thank you very much for a good question. Indeed, it's important because we see also the emergence of impact-based policies, in particular in health systems, healthcare system, where money is very short. So you have input, output, impact, and that is becoming important. So I think we need to come back definitely to your question.
So, and I'm really sorry to rush you at the end, guys. We could go, well, actually, I was going to say we could go on all afternoon, but we are going to go on all afternoon, which is fantastic. So there are, after the coffee break, which is about, let's say, 15 minutes probably at this stage, There are 4 breakout rooms. One corresponds to each of the questions. So, ensuring integrity in the era of AI is breakout number 1. Ensuring integrity in the use of evidence, so by the policymakers, breakout number 2. Protecting the principles of trustworthy policy making, and this would particularly pertain to in an era of perhaps decreased public funding, losses of academic freedom, and so on, those kind of challenges. And then ensuring policy communication with integrity in a world of increasingly cynical publics, unfortunately. So each of those rooms are on this floor. I presume there'll be a number, something at the door. And we will come back here then at 5. Yeah. So 5 p.m. So enjoy your coffee. I want to hear lots of interesting additional information and input from the breakouts, and we'll reconvene here at 5 to pull it all together with any look at all.
Thank you, Maura. And I just wanted to add quickly that we're all staying actually on the same floor. There will be one breakout at the back on AI, the second breakout here on scientific advice amidst global pressures on academic freedom. Yeah, group number 2. Group number 3 will be in the little room next door here. And group number 4 all on the same floor at the back. So we're all staying on the same floor. We don't need to.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay.